This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. This week we have episode 355 entitled The Human Jesus in the Gospel of John. So it's often supposed that the Gospel of John presents the most exalted Christological perspective of Jesus out of the four Gospel accounts. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke may present a human Christology, but John, so this argument goes, presents Jesus as completely God, fully divine, and not a mere human being. This week's episode will explore the evidence presented by the Gospel of John itself as it pertains to the true humanity of Jesus within its narrative. First, we will examine all of the times in which the Gospel of John explicitly calls Jesus a human being. And we'll also note that even Jesus himself self-identifies as a man. Then we will examine several ways in which Jesus possesses common human limitations that one would naturally expect if he was a genuine member of the human race. Finally, we will look at the death of Jesus within the Gospel of John and examine how the crucifixion portrays this figure in thoroughly human terms. So, is the Jesus within the pages of the Gospel of John a bona fide human being, a genuine member of the human race? Or is he simply Almighty God who is now dressed up as a man on the outside? Let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. Our first point today is looking at instances where the Johannine Jesus is called a human being. So we're referring to this Jesus as the Johannine Jesus because it's the Jesus that is presented in the Gospel of John. If we were looking at the Gospel of Matthew, we would look at the Matthean Jesus. The Gospel of Mark presents the Markan Jesus. And the Gospel of Luke naturally presents the Lucan Jesus. So we are looking today at the portrayal of Jesus in the Gospel of John, and scholars call this Jesus the Johannine Jesus. Now, when we look at these instances in which Jesus is called a human being, I am deliberately not looking at the passages where Jesus is called the Son of Man, the Eos to Anthropou. So the Greek noun anthropos is going to appear in those passages, but for the sake of this particular study, I'm looking at just the places where Jesus is called a human being. And so if you want to actually include the references to where Jesus called the Son of Man, you of course can add those verses to the total that we're going to come up with here, and your total will naturally be higher. So Jesus is called a human being with two different Greek nouns. The first one is anthropos, and the second one is anir. So most of the occurrences occur with the noun anthropos, which is just the common Greek noun referring to a human being. So let's look at the examples where this shows up. In John chapter 4, verse 29, the Samaritan woman tells the people in her city, "Come, see a man who told me all the things that I have done. This is not the Christ, is it?" That's John chapter 4, verse 29, to where the Samaritan woman, after having this encounter with Jesus, and Jesus declares to be the Messiah, she walks away thinking, correctly, that Jesus is a human being. He's a man. And that's what she tells her city when she goes and evangelizes that particular city. In the next chapter, John chapter 5, verse 12, where Jesus heals the guy that can't walk, the authorities are asking the person who was healed what happened to him, and he says in chapter 5, verse 12, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Pick up your pallet and walk'?" That's John chapter 5, verse 12, to where the authorities ask the guy that was healed, "Who is the man who is the human being who said to you, pick up your pallet and walk? And of course, the guy that was healed doesn't say, well, he's not really human. He actually is divine. He actually is Yahweh. He actually is the only true God. He doesn't make any of those claims. He believes that Jesus is a human being, the human Messiah. A few chapters later, in John chapter 7, verse 46, the officers answered, never has a man spoken the way this man speaks. John chapter 7, verse 46, where Jesus is clearly called a human being. He's called a man. A few verses later, in chapter 7, verse 51, the crowd say that our law does not judge a man unless it first hears from him and knows what he is doing, does it? That's John chapter 7, verse 51, to where they are looking for the correct way in which to bring Jesus under judgment, and in doing so, they refer to him as a man, as a human being, a member of the human race. The next passage is John chapter 8, verse 40, where Jesus is talking, and this is the important passage because Jesus here calls himself a man. In John 8:40, Jesus says, but as it is, you are seeking to kill me, a man who told you the truth, which I heard from God. This Abraham did not do. John chapter 8, verse 40. That's a pretty good passage for you to commit to memory if you're looking to evangelize your friends and to tell them about the Jesus in the New Testament. Jesus, of course, never claimed to be God, but here he claims to be a man who learned the truth from God. So Jesus distinguishes himself from God quite clearly, and he calls himself a human being. That much is very clear. In the next chapter, when Jesus heals the blind man, there are several references to Jesus being called a human being. So in chapter 9, verse 11, it says that he answered, the man who is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went away and washed, and I received sight. John chapter 9, verse 11. This passage is interesting because the person who was healed attributes the fact that he was healed to a human being, to a man. The fact that Jesus performed miracles did not mean, according to the guy that was healed, that the miracle worker must be God. No, he actually believed that a human being was the one who made him able to see. A few verses later, in chapter 9, verse 16, we get a 2-for-1 deal. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at the passage. Therefore, some of the Pharisees were saying, this man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. But others were saying, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And there was a division among them. John chapter 9, verse 16. So this is a 2-for-1 deal because you actually get Jesus being called a human being twice in one verse. Now, it's very clear here that there is a Christological debate that is actually going on. The Pharisees are saying, yes, Jesus is a man, but he's not really sent by God. He's not really authorized by the true God. They, of course, see the distinction between Jesus and God because they think that Jesus is breaking the Sabbath. And then the crowds are saying that, well, Jesus performs signs. He's performing these miraculous miracles, these works of power. How is it that he's able to do this if you're claiming he's actually a sinner? But they, at this point, still call him a man. So they agree that Jesus is a human being, and Jesus doesn't do anything to change their perception of that. So the division of them is whether Jesus is the man that was actually sent by God or not sent by God, but they both agree that Jesus is a human being. Chapter 9, verse 24. Again, Jesus is called a man using the Greek noun anthropos. Moving along, in chapter 10, verse 33, after Jesus said that I and the Father are one, that is, one in purpose, the Jews answered him, for a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself out to be God. John chapter 10, verse 33. Now, Jesus, of course, disagrees that he is making himself out to be anything, but of course, the claim that Jesus is a man is something that we saw earlier in chapter 8, verse 40, that Jesus himself openly claimed. So that part is actually true. plus the dozens of times we've already seen it in the narrative. In chapter 11, verse 47, at the conclusion of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, it says, "Therefore the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, 'What are we doing? For this man is performing many signs.'" Chapter 11, verse 47. So they recognize that Jesus is doing miracles and signs and wonders, but they don't conclude that he must be God or he must be Yahweh. They say he's a man. He's a human being. He's a member of the human race because God can empower human beings to perform signs. There's nothing controversial about that. A couple verses later, in chapter 11, verse 50, it says, "Nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish." That's chapter 11, verse 50. So this passage is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, as far as our main study is concerned, it's very clear that they call Jesus a man, and they indicate that he's going to die, and he's going to die for the people. And that they think that, well, if we could just get rid of this one person, then our entire nation is not going to perish because we're afraid that Rome is going to come and they're going to exact some revenge on us because this person is getting out of control. The other interesting thing is that we have John's understanding of atonement to where one person can actually die for all the people in the sense of atonement in order that people won't perish. But the person who dies, who is able to fulfill the role of the atonement, is Jesus being called a man. A human being can die on behalf of the people. They didn't think that, well, God has to die for our sins. And actually here, the narrator indicates to us in the context that the speaker is actually speaking prophetically. God is actually speaking through this person, indicating that it is true and that God wants people to understand that a human being will, in fact, die for the people. One man is enough to atone for the sins of the people. Moving along, in chapter 18, verse 14, we have this theme that we just read in 1150 repeated. It says that now Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. That's chapter 18, verse 14. So now we see it twice. It's very clear. The narrator wants you to understand that the theology of atonement in the Gospel of John is for a human being, a man, a member of the human race, is enough to qualify to die on behalf of the people. The person didn't have to be God, didn't have to be Yahweh. He's a man. 3 verses later, in chapter 18, verse 17, the slave girl who kept the door was talking to Peter and said to him, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" Chapter 18, verse 17. So they are referring to Peter as one of the disciples of Jesus, but in doing so, they refer to Jesus as a man, as a human being. Still in that chapter, John chapter 18, verse 29, says, "Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, 'What accusation do you bring against this man?'" Again, the whole trial of Jesus is indicating that Jesus is a human being who is going to be convicted and he's going to be crucified. And then in chapter 19, verse 5, Jesus then came out wearing a crown of thorns and a purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." John chapter 19, verse 5. Again, presenting Jesus as the man. And of course, they dress him up and they mock him as if he is a king. But the reader, of course, knows that Jesus, the human being, is actually the Jewish Christ, the Messiah. And so Pilate, by dressing him up and calling him a man, is ironically telling the truth that the readers already know, even though Pilate doesn't actually believe that Jesus is the king, the Messiah. So those are the references to where Jesus is actually called a human being, using the Greek noun anthropos. But we have the other noun translated as man, and that's the word anir. And this is more gender specific. The anir, of course, is the male human being. And this shows up in John chapter 1, verse 30, where John the Baptist is saying about Jesus, This is he on behalf of whom I said, After me comes a man who has a higher rank than I, for he was before me. John chapter 1, verse 30. So John the Baptist, who is an authoritative prophet, we know that because he was introduced in John chapter 1, verse 6, as the man who was sent by God. So everything that John the Baptist says is considered true from the perspective of the narrator. And John authoritatively calls Jesus a man who is ranked higher than John. And, of course, he is the one who has come after Jesus because John the Baptist is 6 months older than Jesus. So by my count, we actually have 17 times that Jesus is called a human being, combining the nouns anir and anthropos. And when you actually compare that to the number of times that Matthew calls Jesus a man, and Mark calls Jesus a man, and Luke calls Jesus a man, John actually calls Jesus a human being more times than Matthew, Mark, and Luke combined. So if you're going to make the argument that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a human Christology, then John has a much, much stronger human Christology, and the emphasis is so overwhelming. It's hard to overlook those passages. And again, Jesus never claims to be God. He never says, I am God. He never says, I'm the second member of the Trinity. He doesn't say anything like that at all. He claims to be a human being. People call him a human being. His friends call him a human being. The prophets call him a human being. And his enemies call him a human being. And the narrator, of course, knows that that designation is true. Let's move to our second point. Point number 2, Jesus exhibiting human physical needs and limitations. So I think for this particular study, it's not good enough to just simply look at all the places in the Greek where Jesus is called a human being. Let's look at places to where the narrator very clearly wants to portray Jesus as having typical human limitations and needs. So a great example is when Jesus meets the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4, starting in verse 6. So Jesus, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, Give me a drink. That's John chapter 4, verses 6 through 7. So quite clearly, Jesus was traveling. It was getting late. He was very thirsty. It says that he was wearied from his journey. And you'll recall that God, that Yahweh, does not grow weak. He does not grow weary. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 28. Jesus here clearly did get wearied, and he got thirsty, and he's asking for a drink. That's naturally what you would expect for a human being after he's traveled throughout the day on a long journey, and he is thirsty. That's just naturally what we would expect for a human being. And then on the cross, Jesus again indicates that he is thirsty, saying, quite naturally, I am thirsty, end quote. That's John chapter 19, verse 28. So the narrator does not shy away from portraying Jesus as someone who gets thirsty, just like every other human being who needs water to drink. Of course, at the death of Jesus, his death is described in the same way that other human beings, when they die, what happens to them? They give up the ghost. The breath of God leaves them. The breath, of course, is often translated as spirit. So in John chapter 19, verse 30, it says that he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit, which can also be translated, he gave up his breath. But that's naturally what we'd expect for human beings. Jesus died. That much is clear. And another way to kind of understand Jesus as a real, genuine human being is to note the kind of casual way in which the narrator describes Jesus as having actual family members. This is what you would expect if Jesus is a man. He's got a mother, he's got brothers, but if he's really God who became a man, or some sort of heavenly angelic being, or some sort of spirit being that became a man, then these are not really his family members. The mother of Jesus is not really someone who is older than him, and Jesus doesn't really have brothers. But the Gospel of John, just like the other Gospels, portrays Jesus as having family members, brothers, and a mother in a way that's consistent with any person who is a human being. So, of course, Mary, the mother of Jesus appears at the beginning of his ministry and at the end of his ministry. So in John chapter 2, where Jesus is turning the water into wine, Mary takes the center stage. And then at the death of Jesus, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is there physically present at the cross. And Jesus describes her as his mother. We need to take that at face value. And of course, Jesus has brothers. We know the names of the brothers. We know that James is one of those brothers. And so in John chapter 7, verse 3, it talks about the brothers of Jesus. And again, the narrator is not trying to say, well, they're sort of brothers, but not really, because Jesus really is God. He really is the Almighty. No, they portray these family members as legitimate family members because the Gospel of John is portraying Jesus as a human being. He's got brothers. He's got a mother. That much is clear. Let's move to our third point. Point number 3, Jesus' death illustrated in human terms. So we looked at his life. We looked at how people interact with him. We looked at his familial relations. And then we can now look at his death. And so you'll see the way in which the death of Jesus is described, and how even after Jesus had died, the soldiers are going to try and poke him with a spear, and his body is going to look like any other human body that you would poke with a spear. So in John chapter 19, I'm going to start in verse 32. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first man and of the other who was crucified with him. But coming to Jesus, when they saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. One of the soldiers pierced his side with the spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you also may believe. That's John chapter 19, verses 32 through 35. So what we're seeing here is the explicit statement, Jesus died. Now, you'll remember that the only true God is immortal. God can't die. That's what it means to be immortal. You're incapable of dying. But here, the death of Jesus is described as a normal death. There's no qualification in saying, well, he didn't really die, or he only partially died, or he only died on his man side, but his divinity side didn't die. There's no sort of qualification. Jesus was already dead. And then when they poked him with the spear, it indicates that his body is a normal body. Blood came out of it. Water came out of it. And there's all sorts of theories as to where they actually poked Jesus and how the water actually comes to be understood in light of basic human anatomy. But the narrator is quite clear here that Jesus is someone who has died, and he's now bleeding out, even though he has been deceased now for several moments. And then to top it off, the narrator tells you that, hey, these things are true because he's an eyewitness to these things. He's like, look, Jesus really died. They really did this to him. I can testify that there was a real human body that was up there that was deceased and he was dead. He gave up the ghost. He gave up his breath. And what I'm telling you is actually true so that you may believe. He was there. He's telling us this. That much is important. So in conclusion, we have observed that the Gospel of John calls Jesus a human being some 17 times within his Gospel, which is more times than Jesus called a human being in Matthew, Mark, and the Gospel of Luke combined. John presents a thoroughly human Christology. We also observed that Jesus acts and functions as a human being. He gets wearied, he gets tired, he gets thirsty, and he expires on the cross. He dies. And he dies because of the constraints of Roman crucifixion. That's the way the narrator portrays the death of Jesus. We also see that Jesus is portrayed as having human family members. God doesn't have family members. God doesn't have a mother. God doesn't have brothers. We also observe that the death of Jesus indicates that Jesus was mortal. He was susceptible to death. He wasn't immortal, something that God is and that God can't change about himself. We also see that the bleeding of Jesus that came out of his side proves that he was a real, genuine human person. The Gospel of John presents Jesus as a thoroughly human person, full stop. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Please join us next week as we examine how the Christology of the Gospel of Matthew portrays Jesus as the new prophet Jeremiah. You might be familiar with Jesus being the new Moses or Jesus being the new David, but have you seen how the Gospel of Matthew is going to frame Jesus as the new Jeremiah, which of course is a thoroughly human Christology? Please look forward to our next episode. You're not going to want to miss it. Now, if you enjoy our podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the sound truths of the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. You can support us absolutely for free by subscribing, giving us an honest review online, and sharing your favorite episodes with your friends. If you feel led to throw us a few dollars and offer a donation, you can check out the episode description for a PayPal link, or you can subscribe with one of two different monthly subscription options on the YouTube channel. The Biblical Unitarian Podcast is produced and edited by Dustin Williams. I am Dustin Smith, your host. Until next time, please take care.